to share the secret sauce of Ethereum. Please welcome Vinay to the stage.
Thank you. All right. Slides, good. So, can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. So, let's get cracking. A lot to cover. So, this is the title of the talk. Did anybody in the audience know who Ronald Coase was? No? Okay. He got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1940, and Coase's question was, why does the company exist as an institution? Right? Theoretically, if markets are more efficient than command economies because of better distribution of information, why do we then recreate little pockets of command economy in the form of a thing you call a company? And understanding why the company exists is a critical thing if you want to start companies or operate companies, because the question you have to ask is, well, why are we doing this rather than having a market of lots of individual actors? And Coase says, the reason that we don't have seas of contractors, we've got structures like, say, IBM, is because making good decisions is expensive. So last time you bought a telephone or a television or a car, you probably spent like 2 days on the internet looking at reviews, trying to make a decision, right? Familiar experience? All of that is a cost that in a company is made by purchasing. Same thing for deciding strategy. If you're a small business person, you spend a ton of time worrying about strategy, and all of those costs in a large company are amortized across the whole company. The company serves to make decisions and then amortize the cost of the decisions across the entire structure. And this is all about essentially transaction costs. Now, move on to venture capital, right? Paul Graham, famous essay, Black Swan Farming. What they basically say is venture capitalists have no idea what will or won't work. We can't tell, right? We are in the business of guessing winners, but it turns out that our ability to successfully predict is less than 1 in 100. Of 100 companies we fund, 90 will fail, 10 will make about 10 times what we put into them, and 1 in about 1,000 will make us a ton of money. 1,000 to 1 returns are higher, but we actually have no luck in telling which is which, so we just fund everything. Right? So even with their very large sample size, they're unable to successfully predict what will or will not succeed. And if this is true for venture capitalists, how much truer is it for entrepreneurs? As a venture capitalist, you have an N of maybe 600 or 1,000. As an entrepreneur, you've got an N of 2 or 3. So all entrepreneurs are basically guessing that their thing might work with totally inadequate evidence and no legitimate right to assume their guess is any good, because if the VCs can't tell, how the heck is the entrepreneur supposed to be able to tell? Right? We're in an environment with extremely scarce information about what will or will not succeed, and even the people with the best information in the world are still just guessing. Right? The whole thing is just guesswork. So, history of blockchains in a nutshell, and I will bring all of this back together in time. 1970s, the SQL database was basically a software system that was designed to make it possible to do computation using tape storage. You know how in databases you have these fixed field lengths, 80 characters, 40 characters, all this stuff? It was so that when you fast forwarded the tape, you knew that each field would take 31 inches, and you could fast forward by 41.5 feet to get to the record that you needed next. The entire thing was about tape. You get over to the 1990s, we invent the computer network. At this point, we're running everything across telephone wires. This is all pre-Ethernet. It's really, really early stuff, and then you get Ethernet and standardization of DNS and the web. Second generation of technology. The bridges between these systems never worked, right? Anybody that's tried to connect two corporations across a database knows that it's just an absolute nightmare. You get hacks like XML EDI or JSON or SOAP or anything like that, but you always discover that the two databases have different models of reality, and when you try and interconnect them to each other in the middle, you wind up having to write a third piece of software. Yeah. Where are we? N squared problem. So, the other problem is that if we've got 50 companies that want to talk to 50 companies, you wind up having to write 50 squared interconnectors, which results in an unaffordable economic cost of connecting all of these systems together. So what you wind up with is a hub and spoke architecture where one company acts as the broker, everybody writes a connector to that company, and then that company sells all of you down the river because it has absolute power. As a result, actually computers have had very little impact on the structure of business, even though they've brought the cost of communication and the cost of knowledge acquisition down to a nickel. Right? This is where we get back to Coase. The revolution that Coase would have predicted computers should bring in business hasn't yet happened. And my thesis is that blockchains will turn out to be what it takes to cause that to run. So, the blockchain, regardless of all the complicated stuff that you've heard about it, is simply a database that works just like the network. A computer network is everywhere and nowhere. Nobody really owns it, and everybody cooperates to make it work. All of the nodes participate in the process, and they make the entire thing efficient. Blockchains are simply databases updated to work on the network. And those databases have some different properties from the databases that were made to run on tape. They're decentralized. You can't edit anything. You can't delete anything. The history is stored perfectly. If you want to make an update, you just republish a new version of it. And to ensure the entire thing has appropriate accountability, you use digital signatures. It's not nearly as complicated as the tech guys in blockchain land will tell you, right? Yes, it's as complicated as the inside of an SQL database. All of your companies run SQL databases. None of you really know how they work. It's going to be just like that with blockchains. 2 years from now, you'll forget the word blockchain and you'll just hear database and it'll mean the same thing. Probably. How am I doing for time, by the way? There's no clock.
You're good,
10 minutes. Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Right. So we get to this thing called a smart contract. Has anybody heard of smart contracts? Okay, not bad. So again, you'll see lots and lots and lots of complicated rhetoric about smart contracts. A smart contract is a little computer program that is stored on a blockchain. You can store them in other things as well, but pretty much all you're going to hear about in the next few years is smart contracts on blockchains. We all agree what the program is because we can all get a copy of it out of the database. We all run the program. We all agree what the output of the program was. That program is essentially a smart contract. All of this stuff is completely defined by the non-editability of the database plus the digital signature. So in the same way that you've got paper documents, they're theoretically non-editable because everybody has a copy. They're all sitting on the same blockchain. We all know who said what because we got a digital signature from everybody. It's a really nice, clean, easy, convenient way of doing business. It's just not complicated. Right. What you get out the far side of this if you get it right. A democratization of the governance of companies. Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal, but who feels a little disempowered by their phone company? Right? Who feels a little disempowered by Facebook or their electricity company or any of these other things, right? We're all aware that something is profoundly wrong in our relationship with companies because they basically just seem to be farming us, and it really doesn't feel good. My thesis is that the reason that that's happening is because venture capital is just a useless institution for producing what people want, right? What you have is a bunch of people whose job it is to guess about the future and a bunch of assets they're making those guesses with. And the problem with that is that those people are rich already and their interests are very much unlike the users of the stuff that they're doing already, right? There's a fundamental disconnect between the investor class and the users. So what happens if things like Facebook were funded by tens of or hundreds of thousands of people who put in $10 each at the start of the process? Yes, you still get 90% failure. If you happen to get a small success, you put in $100, you get 1,000 back. It's not life-changing for anybody. If you put in $100 and the company becomes a huge success, you might get 20 grand back. That's quite nice, but it's not enough to create a professional investor class. The real payoff, however, is when you get to corporate governance. Because right now, we're in a position where relatively small numbers of people are making undemocratic decisions that affect every part of our lives, because the owners of Facebook can change the terms of service in such a way that you lose contact with everybody you ever knew, right? If you manage to get booted off Facebook, Google, and Twitter simultaneously, you might as well be dead. So what happens if we go through and imagine shareholder democracy based on a crowdfunding platform? 100,000 people put their money in to start the company runs quite successfully, those people are in control of the company, and they use software to run elections to select a board that they like. At this point, you get a substantial overlap between the owners of the company and the users of the company, so you get a convergence of interests between the owners and the users. The increase in shareholder value is no longer measured in purely financial terms because the shareholder and the user are the same person to at least a basically representative level. Now, the problem with doing this kind of stuff, oh, and I should say, the software to do this stuff is being used in Europe by the Pirate Party and a few other places. The problems with doing this kind of stuff are almost entirely regulatory and bureaucratic. If I come and I give a list of my shareholders and it's 100,000 people long and we don't actually have real names for half of them, clearly this is an unacceptable situation for most authorities, right? Your financial services management type entities will just have a cow. So what is required to make this kind of stuff work is a very solid lock on the identity of anybody that's participating in crowdfunding for things like KYC, AML. What's required is a little bit of flexibility on the part of the regulators to say these people are actually legitimate shareholders and we will allow them to invest. We need perhaps something like the US institution of the accredited investor, but brought down to a level where, you know, you're allowed to crowdfund because you signed some paperwork that said you're not an idiot, right? But building a new generation of companies that is genuinely responsive to what ordinary people want and the rapidly changing conditions of the market in an environment where we know that venture capitalists are basically just rolling the roulette wheel just like everybody else is, makes me think that there is a new generation of capitalism coming that will be empowered by blockchain technologies. Good. So what a blockchain gives you is the ability to unify the bureaucratic structures that make every part of this process possible. From the initial raising of the funds, through to moving of the money, through to giving out the share certificates, through to voting based on one of those shares, through to transparency for the company so you can understand exactly what's happening, all of this stuff can be stored on the same common database. So you don't have 37 different systems, you have a single structural backbone that governs every aspect of the company's governance, including the disposition of its shares. And these technologies don't exist yet, but I would estimate we'll have prototypes of this kind of stuff in the wild from 20 or 30 different vendors by the end of this year. As the platforms become available, lots and lots and lots of people have all seen this is coming and will be rapidly building it out. It's the first actual competition the venture capital model has had, really, since it was started. What about the problems, right? Part of the job of a VC firm is to know an enormous amount about the company they're about to put $2 million into. And in a Coasean sense, the company exists because it amortizes the cost of making a decision. So the notion is that rather than having a bunch of extremely deep expertise, you have a bunch of people making tiny little bets where they can afford to lose, which mean they need much less information. If they do want high quality information, they can put 50 pence each into an enormous bucket and they can pay for the information through analysts. But I would say the basic driver for this is going to be small bets on limited information because after all, say it with me, VCs are gambling. If they could predict what would be successful, they would not be funding 90% failure. So, what about the transaction costs, right? The blockchain is for reducing transaction costs. That's what it does, right? John Matonis was up here yesterday, said that they'd moved $300 million of transactions through Bitcoin in the last, was it month? Might have been week. Was it a day? 300 million moved in a day, and it cost the people that moved that $300 million $6. Essentially, transactions are free on blockchains. You can imagine taking all of the enormous amount of gubbins that you get when you're trying to do something like invest in a company and wiping out the transactional costs. Wipe out the transactional costs, change the attribution, the aggregation of information, and what you get is an entirely new class of businesses with a different governance, a different ownership, and a different democratic relationship with their users and the general public. And I would consider all of this to be inevitable as of about 2 years ago. I think the news will hit the papers in the next 6 months to a year. Once we have this stuff in place, right, it should be pretty obvious that if you could do this for venture capital, you can do it for anything, right? I can't think of a single industry that has a good representation, a good mapping between the needs of the users, the needs of the owners, and the needs of the regulators. The way that we operate in our Western societies is that these groups are all in opposition to each other, and most of what's keeping them from working together is bureaucracy and paperwork. if you use blockchain technology as a lightsaber to slice through the bureaucracy and the paperwork while still keeping accountability, you could create a situation where we largely unify owners, users, and governance of systems with a single shared set of common interests. So this is something like the Mondragon co-op model, but inside of a straightforward market capitalist perspective. You get decentralized ownership because we chose to spread the risk a lot thinner, and the result is you get companies that genuinely represent the needs of their users because the users are the owners. Right? And I think that this is a kind of participatory capitalism that is really only one little nudge to the regulators away. If you are all in favor of participatory capitalism, where it's possible for ordinary people to do a little bit of venture capital as a hobby, and maybe you wind up owning a slice of a public utility, let your regulators know it's a good idea. Because that's the only thing standing in the way. The technology is ready. And I think most of us agree that a capitalism which increases the number of people who are participating in governing companies by a factor of, say, 500 would be a better capitalism. More market efficiency, better representation of the needs of users in company decision making. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, sure, I'm here.
Take the, all right, so what's going to make this happen? I love that this is inevitable as of 2 years ago. Papers will figure it out in 2 years from now, and so forth. So thank you for sharing that with this audience here. How many people are acting on this concept of unification of users, owners, and managers of systems? How many people in the world do you think are kind of in with you, keeping up with your thoughts there, and are actively building out systems around those concepts?
Well, I think equity crowdfunding is pretty well accepted as being the next thing, right? And a lot of people are looking at...
What, about 1 million people, 100,000?
Oh, it's hard to know, hard to know. I mean, you do equity crowdfunding stuff. Do you want to take a guess?
Difficult to say.
Okay, so we don't know, right? But certainly an enormous number of companies, and once you start equity crowdfunding as an actual enterprise, look at the size of Kickstarter. I mean, Kickstarter moved, I don't know, some many billions of capital into small projects, and if Kickstarter was allowed to issue equity rather than simply issuing products, I think it's pretty clear that that would scale very, very quickly. Once you put blockchains underneath that, the regulatory overheads should go way down because they're just much more secure and easy to use. And I think that that is largely waiting on Ethereum to ship a platform which people can then come along and build that stuff on top of cheaply. But we are by no means the only game in town for that kind of technology.
Okay. Now, a lot of the conference yesterday and today has been around how David and Goliath could dance and leverage consumer data, not disruptive tech, but enabling tech. Maybe I'm missing it here, but this seems to be, so basically dealing with, they're not so much talking about the discontinuity. What I hear you saying here is you're building in the future. You're basically saying if the Goliaths can't keep up, tant pis, no? Their history.
Well, I mean, not everything can be equity crowdfunded.
Okay.
Right? So if you think about the kinds of things that are crowdfunded, mostly they are consumer junk. Right?
Consumer
junk. They're
junk
toys.
junk.
They're fun things. They're easy to relate
Yeah.
to. I think that, for example, equity crowdfunding large-scale motorway construction is probably not happening.
difficult.
Right? Equity crowdfunding startups that need a certain amount of momentum before people understand what they're for, I think you're still going to need VCs for, because if you can't sell it to the crowd, you can't raise the capital. So you're still going to have a very substantial role for VC to fund the things that the crowdfunding markets are unable to correctly value. Right? But it's a much more specialized role, because right now if you can't get VC, you can't go anywhere. And what you get is VC will get 30% or 60% of the market. Equity crowdfunding will come in for another X percent. It'll start small and it will get however big it gets. So you wind up with this kind of mixed ecology of lots of these things running parallel to each other. Right? Most of the people who come to these kind of conferences are working from a commercial perspective.
Yes.
Ethereum is a non-profit. Right? We give away all of our software. We want people to have these tools. So I can stand up here and say, it will run alongside of everything else. Whereas if I had investors to answer to, I'd have to tell you that it will replace everything else. Right? I'm perfectly happy with an ecology that has all these things in parallel. But what you get is the pressure for each thing to specialize and perform better, which produces better overall services.
Now, I believe in fundamentally believe in alignment. I love the unification that you're talking about. It seems to me that the digital winners, the Facebook, Apple, Amazons, and Googles and so forth, are winning because they're driving the economics of their ecosystems. And it seems that the Uber, Airbnbs are also going after that. It seems that for large measure, the non-tech traditional businesses, not even thinking that thought mostly, and they don't know how to get from where they are to that place.
Yep.
Does your thinking and your intellectual property and what you're giving to the world, does that help them address that on any level? Or are you saying basically they're not going to win the ecosystem economics argument?
Okay, so I think
because it's kind of a macro, you're dealing with the next generation coming through.
Well, so let's take Uber as an example, right? How different would Uber be if it was owned by either the riders or the drivers?
Good question.
Right?
Good question.
My suggestion is that either the riders or the drivers would produce a service which was fundamentally much more humane, right? You know, the kind of atomization of labor that you get in, say, the warehouses that Amazon is operating, built on top of an even worse treatment of labor that you see in the Chinese factories that produce so much of what Amazon produces. I think these are the kind of things that ordinary people are actually kind of against. And we hide them behind layer after layer after layer after layer of corporate PR.
Except that some people will choose, certainly people will never choose, I don't think, to be exploited, but some people will choose to work in more high pressure environments, some people will choose to, so people will still in these shareholder groups, the owners combined with users, people will choose to be in different ones.
Oh, I absolutely agree. But I think where you will see the change is that if you owned a tenth of a percent of something like Amazon, and were actively involved in a democratic structure where all of the people in that company voted for how the company would behave, I think you would see real shareholder pressure to improve standards of living for workers.
I agree with that. And the last question, because I'd love to talk to you all afternoon, but we're not going to be able to do that. We have to do that another time. Is that you've chosen to actually, I had not heard of Coase, so I appreciate that because I'll do some more reading about him and stuff. I think that's a good contribution to the discussion.
The guy to read is Yochai Benkler, who wrote a thing called Coase's Penguin, which examines free software and how free software production is encompassed inside of Coase's economics.
Wow, okay.
There's a book called The Wealth of Networks, which is the crux, and also Robin Chase's upcoming book, Peers, Inc.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Peers, Inc.,
Peers,
Wealth
Inc.
of Networks, Coase's Penguin.
Yeah, all of
Penguin.
that. Just send me email, I'll send you stuff.
Beautiful, thank you, that's great.
Sorry, anyway,
But
your
you
question.
decided to take it, say, why do corporations emerge? Why not individual contractors? You're taking this down to shareholder democracy. Isn't another way to get at the same thing, which is if there's something in it for me, I'm going to care more and so forth, to come from the individual out and my transactional ability in the transaction. Why is it better to come at it from the ownership? Maybe I never get the ownership because maybe your vision for whatever reason stalls or doesn't happen. But by God, if my data is really my data, I could demand to have a cut of the revenue. So why?
Well, so you could certainly approach it from that side.
Okay, but you
right?
didn't.
Well, I mean, got 15 minutes,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
So let me give you two versions of the story about consumers and data.
Okay.
So there's an outfit running on top of Ethereum called Provenance.
Provenance.
Provenance HQ on Twitter. And Provenance wants to do supply chain tracking. So you could take your jeans and you could track them all the way back to the cotton because every transfer that was made was done on a blockchain. So you can actually see the full history of everything that you own right back to its raw materials in their vision of the future.
Interesting.
Right? And imagine the pressure that would give us, the negotiating power that would give us for dealing with companies. Similarly, right, although on blockchains there's basically no privacy, you can always put encrypted data on a blockchain. So you put all your public records onto the blockchains, and then you selectively reveal keys to your doctors or your car hire company or whoever it happens to be. And in those kind of models, the large companies simply never get to amass these enormous, dangerous databases.
Right.
Because when they need access to your information, their app talks to your phone gives them a one-time pass, they go and get the data the one time they need it, and then immediately afterwards they're legally contracted to forget. And that becomes workable if we can do micropayments, because they say, look, without data it's 85 cents, and with data it's free. And you say, fine, I don't mind paying for the service, but you're not going to monitor me.
Very good.
And all of these businesses that are currently operating using targeted advertising models simply switch over to be subscription services, like WhatsApp rather than Facebook, right? WhatsApp charges you $1 a year,
Yeah.
and then it doesn't kill you with ads.
Yes. Yes.
Everything can work that way if you've got good enough payment backbones.
Fascinating. Well, I tell you, Vinay, I certainly would like to talk to you all afternoon. I do hope. Are you staying this afternoon?
Unfortunately, I got to take a flight in about an hour.
Okay. And what was your email address?
Hexiart at, if we go back a slide,
Probably do that.
yeah, there we go. No, maybe it's the other one, the other back? No, different deck or something. Anyway, okay, they're pulling it back up. And if you want a right laugh, punch Hexiart into your search engine of choice and you'll see my other activity, refugee housing.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So Hexiart
Thank you.
at.
fdev.com.
Okay. Well, if we could get that email address back up on.
Yeah, there it is.
There we go.
Thanks for that. Was it?
Hexiart@ethereum.org.
I think I put the wrong email address up there. Well, anyway, I'm easy to find. Vinay Gupta, Hexiart, you'll find me.
Okay.
Hexiart at Gmail works.
Okay. Listen.
Right, sorry.
I vote for you. Whatever you're going for it. You were great. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. That
Okay.
was really powerful.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.